We are very happy to be doing this event, and I'll say a little bit about Orinum, which is a non-profit, unregistered collective of people from the LGBTIQA community in Chennai and elsewhere in Tamil Nadu. We've been around since 2003, and our work includes advocacy, archiving queer and trans resources, cultural programming, and we are really happy to partner with Prajna on these initiatives. So today we'll be talking about the violence of heteronormativity. Typically, when we're discussing family violence or domestic violence, we think of a lot of very overt forms of violence. But now, today, what we thought we would do is just speak about the expectations, rules, and conventions associated with the expectations associated with marriage, with childbearing, with gender roles, with patriarchy, etc., that can themselves impose violence on those of us who are not cis or not straight. So I'm very happy to welcome the panelists.
Now, building on that, I request Sucheta Tenathy to share some of her thoughts. Sucheta is a PhD student at JNU and was last year a Rajaram Fellow at Prajna. She's done some very important work looking at conversion therapy and broadening the scope of conversion therapy and how it's understood. So, over to you, Sucheta.
Thank you so much, Ramki. Am I audible?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm going to talk about the violence of heteronormativity and some of the nuances of conversion therapies. So the COVID-19 crisis has exacerbated a lot of social inequalities for all kinds of marginalized communities in terms of class, caste, race, ethnicity, gender, as well as sexual minorities and disabled people as well. In the case of the LGBT community all over the world, as well as in India, there have been a number of reports of the violence that they have been facing, particularly those who have been confined in hostile home environments, either with natal families who are not accepting of them or with intimate partners who are abusive. So the violence against LGBT people has increased a lot during the lockdown, apart from, of course, loss of livelihood and limited access to essential medications and healthcare and all of that, as well as COVID healthcare, access to COVID related healthcare services as well. So, one of the very stark instances that took place during incidents that took place during the lockdown was the suicide of Anjana Harish. And hers was not the first incident of a person taking their own life after being subjected to conversion therapy, but I think it was the context in which it took place, in a context that is already very hostile, very uncertain, and very damaging to people whose lives are already precarious. That this particular incident has sparked a lot of conversations about conversion therapies and what should be done about them. So there have been sporadic contemplations, not detailed analysis, but contemplations about whether we need a very clear blanket ban on conversion therapies using legislation, legislative interventions. And there have also been some questions about how do you even identify conversion therapies? How do you measure them? If you want to take legal action, you're going to need data and statistics. And how are you going to find them? So these are a couple of questions that I wanted to address, based mainly on Anjana Harish's case. So just to quickly summarize what the case was about, Anjana Harish was a 21-year-old bisexual woman from Kerala who came out to her parents, and she was subjected to a range of conversion therapies. She was abducted. She was taken to a psychiatric facility somewhere in Coimbatore, and then she was forcefully admitted to two inpatient facilities that were de-addiction centers in Kerala. She was subjected to physical assault and a lot of medication, and none of these details were revealed to her. What she was admitted for, what these medications were for, none of those details were revealed to her. Of course, informed consent was not taken. And finally, when she was released from the center, the second center in Kerala, she managed to go to Goa with the help of some friends, and her parents continued to harass her there. and she had to even go to a police station because of a complaint that her parents had made. And with all this stress and this trauma, she took her life in May. And she released a video giving a very, very detailed descriptive account of the harrowing experiences that she had faced in these centers. So some of the important points that emerge from Anjana Harish's case are the role of the family in conversion therapies. Very often, it has been found the world over through United Nations reports, the American Psychiatric Society, etc. These bodies have found that families play a very critical role in administering conversion therapies. There is also a very important component of conversion therapies carried out in informal settings and religious settings as well. In fact, it has been found by ILGA, which is a group that works on LGBT rights in Europe. In their report, they have found that informal forms of conversion therapy outside of formal medical systems are highly pervasive. These include religious forms of conversion therapy as well. Of course, then there are medical professionals, including psychiatrists and a range of other medical professionals as well, who are responsible for conversion therapy. The other thing that is very significant is that a lot of focus on conversion therapy tends to look at practices that are very explicitly coercive, and that take place in some kind of an institution, either a medical institution or a legal or a religious institution. So these could include like what Anjana Harish herself was subjected to. It could be abduction, forcefully admitting someone to an institution, hormone therapy, or some other kind of medication, electroconvulsive therapy. But there are also other more subtle forms of conversion therapy that could take place within institutions themselves. For instance, psychotherapy and religious counseling are very often difficult to identify as conversion therapies. They are conversion therapies, but they are much more insidious. Their violent connotations are a lot lesser. Moreover, there is conversion therapy which does not take the shape of a therapy per se. First of all, there is a lot of questions about whether conversion therapy should be called therapies at all, since they are just forms of violence. But and what also happens is that very often families themselves carry out what I would say curative violence against their family members who identify as gender and sexual non-conformative. These could take the forms of forcefully confining someone to the house, or removing them from the house, or physical assault, or emotional blackmail, or destroying their personal property. These forms of conversion treatments or conversion attempts are not therapeutic in that sense. And they challenge this idea that conversion is something that takes place within an institution. And it's going to be very, very difficult to identify these instances that take place within the home, with intimate family, or with even with religious leaders, because a lot of LGBT plus people's lives are already very precarious within the community. If they're going to come out and report many of these instances that take place with in close settings, in close community or family settings, they would probably experience a lot of fear about what is going to happen to these people, as well as what their status in the community is going to be. So it's very hard to measure or document conversion therapy or conversion treatments or curative violence in any form. So my argument in this particular presentation is that we don't really need any more laws for conversion therapy or any other kind of curative violence, because we already have a lot. I'm going to cover a little bit about what we currently do have. And I'm going to emphasize the fact that it is largely about tackling structural inequalities through various interventions, including counseling, the media, and inclusion of medical professionals in advocacy efforts that are likely to be much more effective than instituting any more laws. So, just to quickly define conversion therapy is used as an umbrella term to describe interventions of a wide ranging nature, all of which have the common belief that a person's sexual orientation or gender identity can and should be changed. Such practices aim or claim to aim at changing people from gay, lesbian, or bisexual to heterosexual and from trans or gender diverse to cisgender. Depending on the context, the term is used for a multitude of practices and methods, some of which are clandestine and therefore poorly documented. So, a common acronym used for conversion therapies is sexual orientation change efforts, which have also been expanded to include from SOCE, sexual orientation change efforts, to include SOGICE, sexual orientation and gender identity change efforts. And like I mentioned, even calling them therapies in many ways is misleading because they don't really have any kind of therapeutic potential. At the same time, there have been some studies suggesting that some forms of conversion therapy could be regarded as torture in the legal sense, using the United Nations definition of torture. But again, because many of them don't explicitly take on that kind of coercive form, not all forms of conversion therapy could be classified as torture, but that still does not declassify them from being violent. At present, there are only 4 countries in the world that have blanket bans on conversion therapy. Those are Ecuador, Brazil, Taiwan, and Malta. And there are partial bans in various forms in the US, Germany, some parts of Australia. Some of these bans are only on children being administered conversion therapies, while others are blanket bans on everyone. So I'm going to briefly mention some of the legal mechanisms that currently exist to deal with conversion treatments. One is definitely the Mental Health Care Act. A number of provisions in the act can be used to prevent these treatments from taking place or to take action against someone who is administering them. So the Mental Health Care Act has given every citizen of India the right to mental health care. So we are in a very interesting situation in India where we don't have a right to healthcare per se, but we do have a right to mental health care. And it is specifically mentioned here that you cannot discriminate against people, which means you cannot deny people access to mental health care on the basis of either gender or sexual orientation. So everyone is entitled to it. At the same time, there are a number of provisions for informed consent within the Act, including, and this is of particular relevance to the Anjana Harish case, Chapter 12 of the Act contains various provisions about admission, treatment, and discharge of people who are admitted in various mental health institutions. For those who are admitted independently, as well as Section 9 of this particular 89 of this chapter, which talks about people who are admitted through a nominated representative. Even if a person is admitted through a nominated representative, they still have the right to informed consent. And there are a number of other provisions about the way their rights have to be safeguarded and the reporting that the institution has to do to the state mental health authority when they admit people through a nominated representative. So these are some of the provisions, apart from, of course, the fact that um, the, 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 the the Mental Health Care Act also says that mental illness per se has to be defined in accordance with international conventions. And since homosexuality in particular is not considered to be a mental illness either in the DSM or the ICD, gender identity disorders does currently exist in the ICD-10. It's going to change in the ICD-11, where it's going to be shifted out of the chapter on mental disorders and into a chapter on sexual health. So in that sense, there are a lot of protections available against conversion treatments within the Act itself. And of course, the Section 377, the Navtesh Johar judgment itself, clearly mentions that conversion therapy should not be administered because homosexuality is not considered to be an illness. So these are, besides, I also want to emphasize that other forms of conversion treatment, like say corrective rape or domestic violence, should actually be tackled by the other existing laws in the country rather than taking them up under a separate ban on conversion therapy, because these are not going to be easy to identify. So again, like I've already mentioned, the role of the family, because the family plays such a critical role in conversion treatments, these issues with the family need to be taken up very sensitively, and a law might not be the best way to go. Sensitization, changing attitudes towards LGBT plus people, working with communities, working with families, and networking amongst mental health professionals, religious leaders, and LGBT plus organizations is likely to help much more. But what I want to emphasize and discuss a little bit is the importance that is given to mental health professions in conversion treatment. So that all over the world, mental health professionals have played unfortunately, a very major role in administering conversion treatment. So there are specific laws prohibiting them in particular because of the role that they have played. In India, mental health professions are very unregulated. For psychiatry, there is a clear licensing system that is available. For psychology, we currently don't have a very consistent licensing system. So there is a licensing system that is available, but it's very irregular. It's only available for people who have a background in clinical psychology or in rehabilitation psychology. You need to have an MPhil for it from a specific institution to be able to apply for a license, and you don't even actually need an MA in psychology right now to practice as a counselor. So because of all these factors, apart from the fact that one of the defining features of the Indian healthcare system is medical pluralism, which is that we have many different systems of medicine. We have Ayurveda, homeopathy, Unani, and very interestingly, all these forms of medicine are also recognized under the Mental Health Care Act, but they have varying degrees of recognition. Yes, they do have government recognition, but there's also a very large unregulated healthcare sector. In this situation, while the existing law can be used as a professional safeguard against conversion treatments, without some kind of community engagement and again attitudinal changes, catering to issues of structural access to mental health care facilities, it's going to be very hard to control medical professionals or any other alternative healthcare professionals from carrying out these treatments and even identifying what these treatments might be. What has been recommended in some parts of the world which have much more regulated mental health care systems is that professional bodies be actively involved in advocating against conversion treatment. So in India, for instance, a lot of associations, the Indian Psychiatric Society, the Indian Association of Clinical Psychologists, as well as psychiatric social workers, have issued statements against conversion treatments. What happens with, again, outside of the Indian Psychiatric Society, for psychology, there is no single professional body. I said there are these bodies, but there's no single professional body um, that is equivalent, say, to the IPS. And even the IPS is not a statutory body. So it's much harder uh, for that to be implemented in India. But definitely it is something that has already been taken up and should be furthered about ethical practice, about professionalism in medical practice. That is definitely something which should be taken up, not just in the professions of psychology and psychiatry, but across all medical professions, as well as the alternative healthcare sector. The other question that I've already spoken about is that a lot of visibility is given to explicitly violent forms of conversion treatments and not to the more subtle ones. And those would have to be tackled in more tactful and subtle ways. I want to mention this as my final point. It's a point that has been of concern to me for a while, and I'm still grappling with how to articulate it. But conversion, if let's just take the Anjana Harish case for instance, what happened to her should not happen to anyone who actually has a mental illness. This is not to say that she had a mental illness or anything like that, but the kind of treatment that was meted out to her, forcefully like abducting her, forcefully admitting her to an institution, administering treatments without her knowledge, no informed consent, physical assault, this should not be happening to anyone who is in an inpatient facility at all. They could actually have a substance abuse disorder, and this kind of treatment should not be meted out to them. So, what we need to do, I think, as LGBT plus people, is that we shouldn't uh, subtly normalize this violence by saying, oh, we are not disabled. This should not happen to us. This should not happen to anyone. Similarly, there is a lot of work that has been done. Bhargavi Davar and Renu Adlaka have spoken about psychiatric violence against women. They speak specifically about cis women. So that is also something that we should be collaborating with, because the only way to handle conversion treatments, or I don't like the word conversion treatments, I'm just using it because the familiar term. I personally prefer the term curative violence, but because this conversion therapy and treatments are more commonly used term. But the only way to tackle curative violence is a multi-layered, multifaceted approach through networking of multiple organizations, professional, non-professional, activists, families, and all this is necessary. We should also be networking with organizations working with people with mental illness so that there can be a healthier society for everyone. So heteronormativity for me would mean actually a basis for collectivizing with groups of people whose violence might be arising from heteronormativity, but it might not explicitly be so. So this is what I have to say, Sonia. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sucheta.